want to share a story with you about my winter deep in the Yukon with my grandfather and the strange things that occurred. Quick note, the story is a little long. About 3 years ago, when I was 18, I decided that I wanted to take a year off school before going to a university, kind of do a bit of soul searching, if you will. As it happened, my father decided that it would be a great opportunity. You see, my grandfather, Dana, had been trying to get me to go to his cabin for a few years now to learn a little bit about myself. My grandfather was the toughest SOB I ever seen in my life. An example, when I was around 15, my family took me skiing in Jasper and my grandfather tagged along. During that trip, Dana hit a fallen log that had been slightly covered in snow, and he ended up going straight into a spruce tree. He tore his lip open down to the cheek. Once we caught up to him and started freaking out, talking about getting an ambulance, he calmly stood up, told us, while his lip was hanging open enough to see his teeth, that he would be fine and was just gonna go back to the lodge. Well, to patch himself up. As it turned out, this involved skiing all the way back, grabbing a sewing needle and some fishing line, and stitching his own face back together in the bathroom mirror. About an hour later, he was back with us like nothing happened. He still has a pretty vicious scar too. A pretty massive guy, around 6'6", and he was very muscular despite being 60. He's a quiet guy. Again, he lives on his own in the middle of a frozen hellscape, at a time in his life when most people would be retired and in a retirement home. The main reason why I hadn't gone with him sooner was because my mother was terrified of me going off to live with my crazy relative for any time, despite my father saying that I would be well taken care of and that I was old enough to fend for myself. But this year was different. I guess because I was going to move out soon anyway. I was allowed to leave and go with him. My family lives in Alberta, and my grandfather lives off the northwestern Yukon, past the Minto mine, just in case anyone knows this area. It was arranged for me to fly out and meet up with my grandfather, who would then drive us to his house. After landing, I was greeted with the amusing sight of my grandfather standing about a foot above the rest of the crowd, just staring, waiting for me. We had a quick greeting, and before long, I had hopped in his truck, and we were making trail towards places where no roads go. We drove for a few hours. Not a lot was said between us, even though that was pretty standard for him, and we finally arrived at what appeared to be a little more than a snowy plot near the tree line and away from the road. So, where exactly is your cabin? I didn't see it on the way over, I asked him. He turned to me and smirked. About 3 days of hiking that way. He pointed to the trees. Wow, so began day one of my adventure. Pack slung over my back and snow up to my calves. We then began to walk. The first day actually went pretty normal, something that was not gonna last. Along the way, he would point out animal tracks and different plants, giving me a basic wilderness survival rundown. Now, I had been raised on a small acreage outside of the also small town of Athabasca, so I was no stranger to the wilderness, but even still, my grandfather's knowledge of the wild seemed near encyclopedic. The first day came to a close as the sun hung low in the sky and the snow glittered in the twilight. A beautiful view. We found a small outcropping. We built a fire, set a can of beans and some veggies to cook, and enjoyed the moment. I slept pretty good, given that it was about -20. On the eve of the second day, I was shaken awake and told to start walking. We don't want to spend more nights out here than we have to. It's only going to get cold, and these woods are dangerous. Gathering up what little I had, little more than a sleeping bag, a few things and 2 knives, we set off again. Let me tell you, there's nothing more tiring than pushing through snow up to your crotch in the middle of the woods for hours and hours. I like to think I'm in pretty okay shape, but by the time that we stopped for a break some 4 hours later, I felt like I was gonna die. My grandfather, of course, seemed pretty unfazed by it. It was around this time that I started to take note of a few things. For anyone who has lived near or spent a lot of time in the woods, you know it's a pretty active place. Lots of noises and things moving around. But not here. In the winter, everything is still and quiet. A strange feeling when all you heard your entire life is that when things go quiet, something bad is near. My uneasiness was offset somewhat by the fact that I was still trying to see if my lungs were gonna explode. Soon enough, we would set off again. A few more hours into walking, I noticed a little cave in the hill we were on. The opening had huge icicles hanging down from the front, and a few bones scattered around the area. I turned to my grandfather and asked, pointing to it, should we be worried about that? At that, he stopped, looked at me for a few moments, then continued walking, saying something like, no, as long as we get a ways off before night, it won't matter. When we found a place to settle for the night, I was sure I would be out before I hit the ground, but with so much as a glance, I was told to wait. He was gonna get firewood and start dinner. Sitting by myself under a tree, I watched as he walked off, leaving me alone there. While I was sitting there, listening to the fading sound of my grandfather walking further and further away, I couldn't help but notice how strange the woods felt. I had spent days camping before, sometimes with friends, other times just by myself. But this was different. Maybe it was the quiet, or maybe it was how the simple act of turning my head seemed to echo through the trees. Maybe it was the way the evergreens burdened by the snow seemed to blend into the growing gloom, forming strange, inky shapes in the dim light. Whatever it was, I was starting to get nervous, the kind of unease that comes when you feel like somebody is watching you, even though you're quite sure you're alone. Before my mind started walking too far down those dark roads of thought, my grandfather came stomping back through the tree line, bundled with broken branches under his arm. He set about showing me how to start a fire without matches or a lighter. He's old-fashioned like that, and soon enough, we had a little nice campfire going. It wasn't until the heat of the fire hit me that I noticed how cold it was. My hands stiff, slight shivers going all around me. We should reach the cabin by about this time tomorrow, if we keep up the same pace. Before we go any further though, I want you to understand something. Things are different out here. If I tell you to do something, I expect you to listen. Understand? I nodded and told him my dad had given me a rundown before I left. Really now? How much did he tell you? Just to listen to whatever you say, and to stay safe, I replied, unsure of where he was going with this. Alright then. He didn't say anything for the rest of the night, and I was too tired to ask. Despite that, I found that I laid awake for quite a while, staring up at the sky and listening to the crackling of the fire. I'm not sure why. I should have had no problem sleeping after the day of hiking, but regardless, I couldn't find myself to drift off, even after the moon had risen and shone over the area. It was around then that I heard something in the forest, like some sort of whispering, almost. At first, I figured it was just the wind, but looking at the treetops, they were not moving. I started to focus more on listening, but I couldn't make out what was being said. It was so faint, I sat up and looked around to see if something was there, or maybe my grandfather had been mumbling in his sleep. When I tried to listen again, I was met with silence. I figured it was just something on the breeze and laid back down again. Sleep came soon after that. I was once again awakened by my grandpa as the sun just began to slow creep up over the distant mountains. As we gathered everything, he asked me if I had slept well. I told him that the cold would take a little getting used to it, but other than that, I was fine. He sort of just looked at me for a moment before grumbling and tying off his pack. Once more, we set off deeper into the wilderness. The third day went without incident. It was only after a few more hours of tedious and exhausting trailblazing that we finally came into view, quote-unquote, home, built right up against a cliff face. There were no windows, just massive logs the whole way around. A small chimney rose up from the roof, easy to spot given the trees that had been cleared into a 20-meter radius around the cabin. As we got closer, I noticed that there were actually fence posts. There was even barbed wire, and just every so often, there was a much taller post set a ways back from the fence. In the dim light, I couldn't really make out much about it, even though I was curious as to why they were there. Whatever the reason, I was not in the mood to play 20 questions. I just wanted to get inside and sleep in a warm place for once. However, before we could get in, it seemed like there were a few things that had to be done. My grandfather lifted one of the fence posts off the ground, allowing us to enter, and told me to put it back and make sure it wasn't gonna fall. He said he was gonna go get the door open. It didn't take long. The snow around the cabin was much less than the surrounding area. It made the walking easier. After I finished, I made my way around the side of the cabin. I found my grandfather carefully taking down numerous little metallic things that were hanging over the door. I could see them from what little daylight was left, but I couldn't really make out exactly what they were supposed to be. Again, I was too tired to really care and just wandered inside behind my grandfather as soon as he finished taking down the last one. "That bed over there will belong to you," he said. Without much more thought, I went over and went to sleep. I really should have soaked in everything, as this was the last good night's rest I was going to get for a while. I woke up the next morning to a mostly dark room. A candle was set on the table in the middle of the cabin, giving enough light for me to figure out where the door was. Opening and stepping outside, I was greeted by a bright midday sun. Down the yard, I saw my grandfather clearing the excess snow from his plot of land. It was low enough that I could actually see the ground, and a few feet beyond the fence. The snow rose like a wall all around us. The 14 hours of sleep actually allowed me to take stock of the area around me. I could now see that the tall fencing posts from the night before had been chiseled or carved down so that only the pale hardwood remained. And carved all over the posts were words, thousands of them, tightly packed together. Reading through them, there really didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to what was written down. Mostly it was just a bunch of random words, mostly in Swedish and a few in Norwegian. I'm not really fluent, but I picked up a little bit over the last few years. I guess Dana had noticed me staring at it. "What are these supposed to be?" I gestured to a similar post around the yard. "A word wall," he said. "It helps keep things calm at night. I wouldn't stare at them too long though. It won't do much good for your head." In case it wasn't obvious enough already, my grandfather was different. He never liked staying in towns or normal houses, and he always carried these little small objects and charms on strings. I always found it neat, and when I was younger, I would often ask what they meant and listen to his stories for hours. My mother, though, always had a problem with him visiting. I did overhear my mom talking to my dad about allowing Dana to fill my head with crazy nonsense on more than one occasion, but my dad often shrugged it off, saying something like, "It's good for him to learn a little bit about Dad's culture." The point is that it was only after I just started to get a look at the cabin and the word wall that these things started to sink in. He was definitely a little strange at times. The first day, we went up to chop a few trees down for firewood, and he would very specifically point out the trees that we were gonna cut. But this was only after pressing his ear to them and listening to see if they were unmarked. When I asked him what he meant by that, "The Tom Tanisa will get angry, and we really don't want that." For those who don't know, Tom Tanisa are part of Scandinavian folklore. They basically look kind of like garden gnomes and act sort of like Santa Claus, or at least that's how they're portrayed now. But growing up, my grandfather would tell me about these little monsters and how they would chew open people's doors and windows, or crawl into houses at night and whisper things to a sleeping person. The people would sometimes go crazy, wandering out into the woods and just rambling on. Other times, they would just sort of be different. Either way, they were freaky little guys, but I kind of stopped believing in the stories during the same time that I stopped believing in Santa Claus. But my grandfather isn't really known for a sense of humor, so listening to him say that was more than a little strange. I sort of just laughed about it, and he looked at me and said, "You think I'm joking? Keep that up, and you won't be seeing the summer." That shut me up pretty quick. I didn't really buy the stories anyway, but I still made sure not to tap the trees that he said were marked. We finished loading up the sleds we had brought with us, and at that point, my grandfather said, "Let's go this way. I want to show you something before we get back." I followed him. It seemed to me like we were making a wide arc instead of going straight back, but I wasn't gonna argue. As we walked, I noticed that there were no animal tracks. Even on the way to the cabin, I had at least picked up a few prints from rabbits or moose and the like. When I asked why we weren't seeing any now, "They don't like it here. They know to stay away." "Why is that?" I asked. "These woods aren't safe for anyone after dark." After walking some more, we got to the edge of the section of the forest that we were in. Dana pointed out that beyond the tree line lay the vast snowy rises and falls of the untamed wild. Honestly, it was one of the most beautiful things I had ever seen. There was an overturned tree, and he motioned for me to sit on it. For a while, we just sat there, soaking in the view. Then he sighed. "Now, I know you're going to be new to all of this for a while, but I think you should know things are different out here. I need you to trust me when I tell you to do something, or else I could get both of us killed. Do you understand?" I said I did. He may be strange, but he means well, so I figured I would humor him, make things a little easier for both of us. That would prove to be a very bad idea. Once we got back and finished stacking the firewood, Dana broke out more of our own stuff that we had brought. As we were cooking, he said that tomorrow we would go hunting. If we caught anything, he would show me how to properly butcher the animal. We ate and settled in for the night, but as we were setting everything up, he told me that if I ever got up to use the outhouse at night, that I should always bring a candle, no matter how bright the moon was, and that if it went out, I should come back inside right away. With that, he set up a few things on the door. When I asked him about it, he told me it was there to confuse anything that was trying to get in. Later that winter, I found out that it was supposed to be a rune for illusions or disguises. I guess the idea was that it would make it difficult to tell what was inside the cabin if something was trying to get in. The next few days we went out hunting. For the first little bit we didn't catch anything. It wasn't helped by the fact that we needed to go a certain distance from the cabin before we saw any signs of animal life. Dana always insisted that we be back before nightfall. On top of that, he didn't bring a gun, ever, just a bow and some arrows. I know bow hunting is common enough practice, but given that bears roam these woods, I figure it would be nice to have something with a little bit more stopping power. When I mentioned this to him, he said it would cause more trouble than it would prevent. Eventually, we were able to find and snag a buck, a nice one too, enough meat to be alright for a while. We threw it on the sled and began dragging it back home. More hours went by. When we got back to the cabin, something rather interesting was waiting there for us. Some ravens. Normally, this wouldn't seem so strange, but when I hadn't seen any signs of life except for the trees in this area for almost a week, it seemed a little bit off. Dana actually stiffened up when he noticed it too. When I asked him about it, he told me, "Drop the sled and come with me. We're gonna have to butcher this fast." I wasn't quite sure what was going on, but I remembered the conversation from earlier, and I figured it would be best to just keep my mouth shut and go along with it. We circled around the cabin, the raven sitting on the roof watching us the whole way. Lying in a small snowdrift in front of the door was a rabbit's head, just the head, cleanly cut off. The snow was still a little bright red, so it must have been a fresh kill. There was also something through the snow leading up to it, but it looked like it had been thrown in there. Well, that could be worse. We didn't really need the head anyways. When I asked what he was talking about, Dana told me, "It's only right to return a gift." with a gift. Take that inside and meet me near the shed. The shed was a little ways off from the word wall, just a few feet beyond the tree line. That evening, we butchered the deer. When we were done, Dana took the head, antlers and all, and walked out into the woods a short way before gently setting it down. And coming back, we brought the rest of the meat into the cabin, and Dana took the rabbit's head off the table where I had placed it. That night, we had rabbit stew and potatoes. When I asked why we were just gonna eat something we found there, he told me it would be rude to just throw it out, and it isn't wise to insult the neighbors. There's more people here? I thought you lived alone, I asked. Alone? No, I just don't live by any sort of people. So, who's your neighbors? I thought I told you already. The Tom Tanisa lives here. I didn't really have a good response to that, to be honest. The next morning, we went out to check the fence, something that was becoming quite a routine. I walked out to where he had placed the deer head. It was gone. Not even a bit of blood was left. The next few weeks went by peacefully. We would collect firewood, go ice fishing, and every morning, we would clear the snow away from the cabin. The temperature continued to drop as the winter solstice drew near, and the already short days became a few hours of twilight. You'd think it would get old seeing the same setting throughout the day, but you'll be wrong. It was breathtaking each and every single time. I should have stayed there staring at it all day if I wasn't being ushered along by Dana. Things would have continued much the same way if I hadn't screwed up one night. It was somewhere around mid-December. You start losing track of the days out here, especially when they are mostly night. And we were going ice fishing again. We set out pretty early, as the sun was just barely peeking over the distant mountain range, and hiked for about an hour until we got to a small frozen lake. We set about the usual, checking the thickness of the ice, cutting a hole. It had only been a few minutes when we heard it, the snapping and cracking of branches behind us. We both stopped and stared for a few moments before Dana said it was fine, even though I could tell he was bothered by it. Every so often, he would look over and scan the trees. We weren't having much luck with the fish and were about to call it a day when I got a tug on my line. I pulled up a big one and thought, great, we haven't had fish in a while. I turned to see if Dana had noticed. I saw him just sort of staring at it, a little confused. When I looked more closely, I saw that the fish had a few gashes taken out of it, little lines cutting along the gray scales. Throw it back. This isn't ours to take, Dana said. Alright then. I was a little nervous, even though nothing happened during my time there. I was able to pick that up when Dana got weird like this. It was best not to argue. I threw the fish back into the pond, and we started making tracks back to the cabin. Along the way, I noticed that the trees near the lake, the ones where the noise had come from, had huge cuts taken out of them, not like an axe or bear claws, more like small chunks that had been ripped out and thrown around. I then asked what that was about, and Dana just started walking faster and said, "We're not gonna come back here. It wouldn't be safe." One of my more frequent chores was to go out and make sure that the word wall's posts were still secure in the ground. One of the many things that my grandfather was really strict about was keeping the wall just right. The word wall came second only to our food stores. This mostly involved going out and giving the posts a solid shove. If there was any shift, I would need to hammer them back in and pack the snow tighter around the bottom until I could no longer get them to move. Anyways, that night, Dana insisted that we go over all of them again before going to sleep. So we went out after finishing dinner, mostly deer. You'll be surprised how long a single deer can last. Dana took one end of the yard, and I took the other. It was getting really cold outside, to the point where any bare skin started to sting. A cloud cover had swept over the land, and there were no stars nor the moon tonight. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving everything in the inky black and gray. It was quiet again, like on the hike up here, where every little movement you made sounded like an earthquake. A little ways off I could hear my grandfather working, the shifting of his coat, the snow being pressed underfoot. I had already done about 3 posts when I found one that was a little bit loose. I was able to get it straight, and then I picked up the sledgehammer we used for driving them back into the ground. As I lifted up the hammer to get ready to bring it down on the post, I cringed, knowing that the sounds in the forest would be very loud. Just as I was about to swing, I heard something, like a quiet hissing mumble. I swung around while I was bringing the hammer down, hitting the post with a glancing blow and knocking it off center. Spinning around, I tried to listen for it again, thinking that maybe it was just my imagination. The woods will often make you think you're hearing things. After a few seconds of nothing, I figured it was just me imagining things, or overhearing Dana talking to himself. I turned to start fixing the post again, but just as I put my back to the trees, I heard it again. It seemed so quiet that I couldn't make out what was being said, but I was so sure that someone was whispering, quickly, and in a whistle-like tone. I already started to freak out now. I slowly began walking towards the cabin, my back to it and the cliff face, as I scanned the trees looking for where the sound was coming from. The noise didn't seem like it had a direction. It was like it was everywhere at once, still quiet, but it was very much there. While in panic mode, combined with being tired and cold, I got it in my head that if I threw something into the woods, it might scare off whoever or whatever was there. Reaching into the woodpile we had outside, I picked up a small log and threw it into the tree line. I started shouting, "Who's ever out there, you better come out now." My grandfather then came running over. "What the fuck are you doing?" I told him I heard someone talking nearby, but before he could say anything, the trees where I threw the log started to shake, and I could hear branches snapping. "Get inside right now," he said, not taking his eyes off the trees. So the two of us backpedaled into the cabin. By the time that we closed the door, most of the trees had started shaking, the once oppressive stillness of the woods replaced with something like that of a hurricane. That night, Dana nor me slept. We just sat there staring at the door, and he was clutching his hunting knife. Throughout the night, all the sounds didn't die down. It was so loud and violent that I thought the trees must be snapping in half. Periodically, we would hear things hitting the cabin wall. Dumps, crunches, and ripping noises from every direction. I told myself that it was just branches and debris being thrown by the storm. But deep down, I wasn't sure. I didn't know. About an hour before dawn, things started to settle down. Soon enough, my grandfather got up and went outside. I heard him start swearing, so I hurried after him to see what had been done. The outside walls of the cabin had been covered, every inch from top to bottom, with what seemed to be words everywhere, violently slashed into the wood. Chunks had been ripped out of the corners of the door, and the fence was in ruins. Some of the barbed wire had been thrown into the treetops, and many of the posts had been smashed. After a string of curses I could barely even understand, Dana started to calm down. "Never fucking do that again. Never. We need to get this fucking fence fixed before nightfall." And just like that, he set off to start gathering the broken fence. At this point, I had gone from thinking my grandfather was a little crazy to thinking that he might actually know something I didn't. I then helped them pick up the scattered remains of the fence. Every so often, we would find little bits of fabric or hair stuck to the barbs. At this point, I didn't want to ask anything. We were making good time repairing the barbed wire, but I was still worried. Most of the posts that made up the word wall had been broken down and were missing. When I asked them about this, Dana said, "They won't like it, but hopefully they just did this as a warning. Tomorrow, we're gonna go hunting, and we're gonna bring them back something to thank them for not killing us last night." At this point in the year, there were only about 6 hours of daylight, making it very difficult to do anything at all. We were able to get the barbed wire back into a rough semicircle around the cabin. Given the damage from the night before, I asked how much good the barbed wire would actually do. He told me that it wouldn't stop them, but it would slow them down, since their beards and hats would get tangled in it, and they would have a hard time getting free. I couldn't tell if he was trying to joke or not, but at this point, I was about ready to believe anything. Little did I know, I hadn't seen anything yet. The problem was that by this time, it was almost December 21st. The cold was near unbearable, and there was so little daylight. By the time that we got to the part of the wild where the animals roam, it was nearly time to head back. The first day, we looked for signs of animals we could bag, but we didn't even see a squirrel. That night, the wind was blowing pretty strong again, and the cabin was creaking to the point where I thought it might collapse on us. All the while, I stared at the cracks between the log walls, where the candlelight didn't reach. I could swear I saw things moving in the dark. When I finally did drift off to sleep, the last thing I heard was a quiet whispering. Just like before, the next few days were no better. Every time we went deeper into the woods, usually in the way of the distant mountains, the cold was bone-chilling, so much that walking was a challenge for me. I have no idea how my grandfather was able to at his age, but he never slowed down. Yet, we returned empty-handed every time. Each night, the woods became loud. The shadows in the cabin seemed to draw closer to the candle more than the night before, and the whispering started to grow more intense. It got to the point where I could make out some words, though none of them were in English or any other language that I knew of. I couldn't understand them. On the third night, I asked my grandpa if he could hear it as well. He simply told me not to think about it. Each day was more overcast than the one before. The daylight was just a lighter shade of gray, and it was getting to the point where our food stores were running low. Our need to find something became desperate. Things started to get worse by the fifth day. It started to snow again, but not the soft, puffy snow that you see further south. This was big, heavy, wet flakes that seemed more like little snowballs falling everywhere, clinging to everything and weighing us and the trees down. All the while, we went through the misty forest, where we could barely see anything more than a few meters in front of us. I swear I kept seeing things out there, little shapes sitting on rocks or in the branches of trees. They would be there one moment, then disappear as soon as I looked directly at them. I asked my grandfather about it, and he told me not to pay attention to them, but just to keep moving. The longer the days went, the more of those shapes I saw. On the 9th day of trying to hunt something, we returned to the cabin and were greeted by a troubling sight. Along the tree line surrounding the cabin, a few meters from the barbed wire fence, were a number of stones, big boulders, each about chest height. Some of them were shaped weird, with their tops curving off in different directions. They were all pointing at the cabin and had been placed every few feet along the tree line. When my grandfather saw this, he stopped and said, "Pack your things, we're leaving at dawn." I wasn't gonna argue at this point, even after we got past the fence and closed the door. I felt like we were still being watched from somewhere out in the snow. It was too dark to see any of the little shapes anymore, especially the ones that had been following us whenever we went outside, but I knew they were still there. We didn't sleep long. Sometime in the middle of the night, between the wind blowing, there was a crash, and the door split down the middle. Frost and snow started flying in, and it blew out the only candle. Before we even knew what happened, there was a weird noise. After a few seconds, my grandfather was able to get a little oil lantern going that was hanging by the wall. The table and pantries had been overturned. Everything that wasn't nailed down was either broken or thrown around the room. I asked if we should leave right now, but he told me, "That's exactly what they want us to do. We'll wait until first light." It was the longest night of my life. We sat there, shivering and staring at the broken door, the lantern's light just barely keeping the dark, and who knows what else at bay. Several times, I thought I saw something there, just outside the door, watching. When I saw the horizon getting brighter, it was like waking from a nightmare, only this one wasn't over yet. We grabbed whatever hadn't been broken and made for civilization. The snow had stopped, but the clouds still hung heavy above us. It would be 3 days until we got to the truck. We moved as fast as we could. The snow was so deep that we had to stop every few meters or so just to wipe it off. It would continuously weigh us down. I don't know how far we traveled. I know we didn't stop, and I don't think we ate until it started getting dark. My grandfather said to get as much firewood as I could. He said we were going to need a big fire. But what about the marked trees? I said to him. I still wasn't sure if things could get worse. Fuck them all. They're already pissed off, and it won't matter much now. Just get as much as you can. That night, we had a massive bonfire going. I bet you could see it from one of the mountains. It was so bright. Even so, we could still hear them out there. The whispering would never stop. Every now and then, a branch or rock would come flying at us or in the fire. It didn't make for a restful night. You know, it was serious at this point when grandfather had violated his own rules, you can say. Around an hour before dawn, the snow started again. The second day was worse yet. With the snow back, the little things got brave and started coming in close. Every now and then, we would get hit with something that fell from tree branches, or a tree along our path would fall down and make it more difficult to go through. We didn't walk. We ran through the woods as much as we could. I didn't think I could run so far, but I don't remember either of us stopping. We were able to stumble into a little clearing as the light was fading again. We quickly grabbed whatever wood we could find and tried to start a fire. However, the wood was wet, and the shadows started to close in. We could see the little moving figures at the edge of our vision once again. I guess Grandpa was getting his wits' end because he grabbed a little oil lantern and broke it open, pouring the oil across the logs and lighting it up with the lantern sparker. The shadows retreated for a moment, and I think whatever they were started getting angry. We were left mostly alone that night. I don't know why. Maybe they needed to rest sometimes too. Shit, I don't know at this point. The snow hadn't quit yet, so by the time that we woke up, we were both mostly covered. We set out before the sun rose. I think Grandpa didn't trust us to make the rest of the way with only a few hours of light. The trail was a mess. Trees and rocks littered the animal trails, and the bush was so thick with evergreens that it was no better. It was slow going, and of course, we were still being followed. We would still catch sight of them at the edge of our vision, watching and whispering in tune with the wind. For whatever reason, we were left mostly untouched the rest of the way back. The poor trail conditions slowed us down to the point that it was already dark, and we still hadn't made it to the truck. However, my grandpa didn't want to stop. He said we were close and didn't want to risk another night outside. I'm not sure when it was, but eventually, we made our way out of the trees and onto a road. We followed it for a few minutes until we saw it, the glorious steed that would get us out of that place, covered only a few feet of snow. Even though we were freezing and exhausted, we swept off the truck bed, threw our things inside, and drove off. I don't think either of us looked back. After we got back to town, we stayed at a hotel for the night. Well, at an inn. It was actually the best rest of my life. We woke up early and drove the entire day until we got to the Eric Nelson Airport. When we got back, my grandpa stayed with my family for a little bit. After my dad convinced them, we didn't talk much about the trip, just that we needed to come home early. That spring, my grandpa left and said that he was going to go back home. I asked him what in the hell he was thinking, going back there, and he told me that he had lived in those woods for almost 20 years. It was his home, and he was going to stay there for as many years as he had left. However, he promised that he would call or visit whenever he could. That was 3 years ago, and none of us have heard anything from him. My parents are convinced that he passed away. They might be right, but I can't help wanting to know, and that's where we're at today. I told my friends about what happened. They don't really buy it, but I can't blame them. They've been talking on and off for about a year now about going on a camping trip, and I mentioned that maybe we should go up to my grandfather's cabin. They thought it was a great idea. We're currently in the Sky Motel in Whitehorse, and we're gonna leave tomorrow morning. I'm still convinced that this is a bad idea, but I want to know what happened with my grandpa when he came back out here. We plan for the trip to be a little less than a month. And of course we pick summer since I think it's safer than the dead of winter like last time. So this will be the last time that I post until I come back. I hope to update you all pretty soon. But if you don't hear from me, there's a reason why I told you the name of the locations, including the motel. Before I get into the story, I think it's important to give some background for those who might not be familiar with our ways or our land. I am Oglala Lakota, and if you know anything about our people, you'll understand that our connection to the land is special. Everything around us, every rock, animal, and tree has a spirit, and some places are more sacred than others. Places like the Red Shirt Table, where the story takes place. Well, you see, the Red Shirt Table is part of the Makoshicha, or you might be more familiar with the name, the Badlands. And if you've ever been out here, you'll know that it feels like you're in some other place. It's rugged, yet beautiful all at once. Hopefully that makes sense. The area has always been known for strange occurrences, paranormal sightings, ghost stories, deer people, you name it. Some people even think it's just stories, but those of us who grew up hearing our ancestors tell us, know better. These places have seen generations of history, ceremonies, battles, and spirits. It's even said that the land remembers everything. We the Lakota pass our stories down to each other. Our language, our songs, and our prayers are sacred. And when you listen to the old ways, like the songs of our ancestors, it's not just a history. These stories always have a lesson, warnings, and connections to the other side. I'm not trying to scare you. If anything, I'm simply trying to inform you. When you're out in a place like Red Shirt Table, you'll understand why these places have such a hold on us. My name is Bill, and I live on the Pine Ridge Reservation. If you're from the Pine Ridge Res in South Dakota, you're most likely familiar with the name or been to the area known as Red Shirt Table. The colors are striking as the sun sets in the evening in the west. There's a lot of deer and other wildlife here, so it's a great place to visit and to get away from things when you feel the need to do that. As I mentioned before, it's also known for the strange things that happen as you drive through the area. Lots of reports of deer people, ghosts, spirits, and other sorts of strange things that happen. A few years ago, my friend Terry and I decided to camp out on the west end of Red Shirt. From there, you can see the Black Hills and there's an awesome view of the prairie down below the table as the sun sets. It even made it into a movie, but under a different name. If you've seen the movie called Thunderheart, Val Kilmer and Graham Greene refer to it as the Red Deer Table. In the movie, they allude to the fact that it was a mystical place. So we set up our tent, started a fire, started cooking our supper while we were waiting for the coffee to get done. Nothing like coffee over an open campfire, but I'm getting off track here. We watched the sunset and spent the evening talking about lots of things, watching the stars in the sky. I think it was around midnight when we finally decided to go to bed. We went to sleep, and then it started around 3 in the morning. We both woke up at the same time. I heard something moving outside the tent, and then Terry opened the tent flap and looked out. We couldn't see anything. Even though it was a bright night, it didn't feel right. Even though we agreed to bring our guns along in case we saw some deer. Out of the two of us, I was the only one that brought a gun. I got out of the tent and went to his pickup. I opened up the toolbox in the pickup bed and got my gun. We both looked around. We couldn't see anything, so we went back to the tent. We barely closed the tent flap when we heard movement outside the tent again. We both looked at each other and just listened. There was something outside, and we could hear it moving around the tent. It moved towards his truck, and we both heard it try to open the doors. Terry yelled out while he was in the tent that whoever it was better show themselves. We turned on our flashlights and came out of the tent. I had my gun locked and loaded. Then as we came out, there was nothing. We shined our flashlights around his truck, and we couldn't see anything on the open prairie, where we had set up camp at the west edge of the table. We went back to the tent and just sat there listening and talking quietly about what it could be. As we were talking, that's when we became aware of a whooshing sound. It was kind of low at first, and then it got loud. The sound was coming from his truck, and we could hear the sound of footsteps again trying to open the door to his truck. We both jumped out of the tent without saying anything, hoping to catch who it was that was messing with us. As we came out, the sound stopped again, but this time, the inside cab light was on, and this only comes on when the door is open. Terry ran to the passenger side of the truck as that is where the sounds were coming from when we were in the tent. Something had opened his truck door enough for the cab light to come on. We both checked it out, and we both started yelling out that whoever it was better show themselves. That's when I fired a round off into the air, but no one showed themselves. We stood outside the tent for a good 20 minutes just looking around, trying to see where someone could hide out in the open like they were doing. We both decided to go back into the tent to see if whoever it was would come out again. However, the whooshing noise started again, but we waited. It was getting loud when Terry opened the tent flap real quick, and when he did, the noise stopped, but we could hear something by his truck. He shined his flashlight towards his truck. The twin antennas for his CB radio were moving by themselves like windshield wipers that were possessed or something. The passenger side was moving in opposite direction of the one on the driver's side. They were moving really fast. They were spring-loaded, so it takes a lot of effort to get them to move. Even going down the road at 65 miles an hour, they would barely move. He went to the driver's side. I went to the passenger side. We stood there staring at the antennas moving by themselves. It was super creepy, but I swear, they were moving on their own. And that's when we heard it. There was something at the west end of the table. Terry followed me as I took the lead. I had my gun ready for whatever it was that was making noise. As we reached the edge of the table, I looked over the edge, and that's when I heard it. Some drumming, down below in the dark, and someone was singing in Lakota below us. It wasn't the one that we hear today. It was the Lakota language that my grandma and grandpa spoke when I was a kid. Even then, there was a lot of words that I didn't understand, and in the dim starlight, I swear, we could see some sort of teepees that seemed to shimmer, fade in and out of focus. We both heard it, and we just looked at each other. That's when we made our way to the tent. We went to sleep to the sound of singing and drumming. As soon as the sun rose at 5:30 a.m., we packed up and left. Terry and I didn't speak much about what happened. You don't talk about these things. We both knew that we weren't meant to be here any longer. Whatever we had experienced, whether it was meant for us or not, was something we didn't need to be involved in. Whether the spirits had finished whatever ceremony they were holding, we knew it was time for us to leave. The land has its way of reminding you that it remembers. Red Shirt Table is full of memories, with spirits, and with history. You can't explain it, but you can feel it. I still think about that night every now and then, especially when I drive through that area. There's something comforting about it, in a strange way, knowing that the old songs are still being sung, and that the land is still alive. It's a reminder that we're not alone out here. Not really. Land is everywhere, watching, and every now and then, if you're quiet, you might just hear it speak. The old languages that were spoken get lost through generations. A reminder that you should preserve your way of life. We both talk about going back to camp, but we never did. This story is the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. I live in Montana, where people are known for seeing tiny people in the mountains. Me and at least 5 other people decided to go out and have a few drinks to celebrate one of our buddies' birthday. We will call him Bill. It was July 15, 2017. We were over at his house smoking weed and having a few beers. One of the buddies said that we should go out and do some scary stuff to see who would chicken out first. Everyone agreed, being the cross-faded people we were. Bill said that there was an abandoned barn on his land, and his parents always told him to never go over there because of reasons. He said he will tell us the reasons on the way there. So we all get up and leave and started to walk to the barn. The barn was at least 20 minutes away. There was nothing but grass and open fields because he lived on what used to be a farm. So there were a lot of acres of land. Bill started to tell the story of his great-great-grandfather and how he used to beat his different wives in the barn to teach them lessons. But one day, he ended up chaining one of them up. His fingernails started to turn black. He started to scream that he was on fire. It said that his skin slowly turned more black, all the way up to his head and covered his whole body, almost like he was getting burnt. Once the story was finished, we got to the barn. We all looked over to it. It's exactly how you would think a barn would look. It was painted red, but it was very old. This was around 9 p.m., so it was pretty dark. Bill walked up to the door and we all followed. He opens the barn door, and it becomes loose from the barn and falls flat on the ground. If one of us stood in the way of the door, we would have been killed. We continue on through the walk into the barn. It was quiet. No bugs or rats could be heard. We walk around the place. One of our buddies pulls out a phone and shines the light so we could see. He shines it at the horse entrance of the farm, the door at the back. And that's when we see somebody crouching down, its eyes glowing like somebody was taking a picture of a cat. However, its back was arched up. It crawled on two legs, and its two long arms. The arms had huge claws on them, almost like a wolf, but without the fur, as it was just staring at us. Everything happened so quickly, but that's when we all started running. As we exit the barn, passing the door that had fallen, we kept running and running, and that's when we heard a loud cracking sound. I looked back, and you could see this thing cracking its neck from side to side. It was just standing there, at the entrance of the barn. We ran all the way back to the house, not looking back after that. We all decided to stay out in the living room, since it was the smartest thing to do since we were in a group. One of our friends said he couldn't sleep on the floor, and he was begging Bill to let him use his room to go to sleep. Bill did actually let him sleep in the room, and we all fell asleep about an hour later. We ended up waking up around 3:30 a.m. to hear an old man screaming from Bill's room. We know it wasn't his father, since he was out of town, nor was it our friend, so we all tried to get back into the room, but it was locked. Bill then told everyone to back up, and he kicked the door down and went into the room to see our friend curled up in the corner, covering his face with his knees. We all walk over to him and try to convince him that it's okay, that it's just us, but he pushed us away, and he said, "Leave me alone." We left the room not knowing what happened, and as we go downstairs, the front door slams open, and we see something heavy, crawling really fast, out into the field. We run outside with a flashlight, and we see that it's the same thing that we saw back at the barn. It started running and jumping almost like a lion does, but more air in between the run. Let me just say that we didn't even sleep that night. Our friend still doesn't want to talk about what he saw that night upstairs in the room. Whenever he does try to say something about that situation, he starts to throw up and become scared. I soon started talking about this story when I went camping with friends a few months after, and they said I encountered most likely a flesh gate. I'm pretty new to this, but I just had to get this out there. I have to tell someone about this, and I felt like this was the best place to tell people. This all started when I used to live in a small town in Arkansas, with a population around 5,000 plus people. It was a typical average conservative town. In the summers it was hot and humid, and in the winter it was dark and cold. I grew up on southern entertainment, driving four-wheelers, and hunting every deer season, and maybe some small trapping here and there. But this happened during my last year of high school. I was 17 at the time. I had a girlfriend, lots of friends, and a shabby 1972 Ford pickup. that I still have to this day. Anyways, it was November. Rifle season had just started, and I had been getting ready for it. My friend, his name is Drew, and I had been planning this trip for months, and we had everything ready. It was Friday, the end of the week, and the start of the weekend. Our plan was to hike up through the national forest, onto the mountain and set up camp and just have a good time. I wish I could have done something to have stopped myself. I woke up at 3 in the morning, leaving a note for my parents and putting my things in the bed of my truck. I hopped in and drove to my friend's house. He was already waiting for me outside. I got out and said in a whisper, "You have all your things? I don't want to forget anything." "Yeah, I checked again before you got here," he said. He put his bag in my bed and put his gun in the truck, and we took off to the mountain. I had my eyes fixed on the road, and Drew was sitting there with a metal click, and I looked over and he was flicking a lighter on and off. "What's that?" I said, putting my eyes back on the road. "Oh, it's my grandfather's lighter. He had it with him all throughout the war." We then turned and went through the entrance to the hiking site. The change from road to dirt was just as familiar as ever. We stopped and got out. We put on our bags and headed up the mountain trails. It was around 7 and we could see where we were going because the sun was coming over the trees. The birds were chirping and I could see the squirrels running through the trees chattering. 3 hours of hiking later, we came up the campsite that we followed with our map. When we got there, we quickly set up our tarps, and we were quick to find firewood and to start a fire. I told my friend that I would get us some lunch, and I headed off with my rifle to go get something to eat. I walked for at least half a mile south, and found myself breaking the tree line. I decided I would sit and watch for a bit. I sat underneath a large oak tree, and looked for any movement. The sun was rising slowly. I was sitting there, when all the birds stopped for a moment. The silence was deafening. The sharp ringing in my ear was eerie. I scanned slowly with my eyes only, staying as still as possible. That's when I saw movement across the field. It was hard to make out. I slowly raised my rifle and looked down the hill. A deer had poked its head out of the tree line. I only saw its head and neck from where I was at. I knew it was risky to take a shot, but I also knew I wouldn't have another chance to bag another deer. Regardless, it was a doe anyhow. That's when I noticed something. The deer's head was higher off the ground than most deer should be. I felt like it was watching me. It slowly turned to the left. I could only see its neck and shoulders, and I could hear leaves crunching as it moved deep into the dark forest. A little nervous, I decided to head back to camp. I followed the mental landmarks that I saw the first time. A tree that had fell over, dried up creek bed, and I could see the tarps in the distance through the trees. When I got back to the campsite, we decided it was time to catch up on some sleep. I crawled into my tent and got in my sleeping bag and fell asleep. We got up early that morning. It was still as eerie as it was the day before. It just felt so weird, different. No animals in the area, just silence. It was strange. The air felt heavy. There were no birds anywhere, no deer, rabbits, or anything. Not even any crows crying out. We were getting hungry, and when the sun set, we nestled down waiting for some game to come around. It soon grew dark again, and we decided to come together and to make some beans that I had packed just in case we didn't catch anything. As we were getting everything ready, my friend Drew got up from his seat and said, "I'll be right back. I gotta take a piss." I sat there drinking my water, watching the fire dance. And after some time, I noticed that Drew had been gone for a while. That's when I started to get concerned, and I heard leaves crunching, and I jumped and looked towards where the sound came from, and it was Drew. However, his face was pale. "Dude, come over here," he said. "What's over there? Just come over here and look," Drew said as I got up to follow him into the darkness of the forest. As I was walking, I started smelling something horrible. something pungent, and it got stronger and stronger as we walked deeper into the woods. The smell was so bad, and then, as I was walking, something fell on my shoulder. I turned my head to see what it was, but the smell of death made my stomach churn. I leaned over and started to throw up, while this thing that was on my shoulder fell to the floor. It hit the ground with a sickening, squishy sound. I pulled out my light and pointed it to the ground. I got confused for a second when a drop of blood fell on my hand. I looked up and my heart skipped a beat. What I saw was disturbing. The guts of an animal, limbs, pieces. A squirrel that had been impaled on a branch, what was left of it at least. I looked at the face of Drew, still drained of all color. His mouth was open, eyes wide. "Dude, what the fuck?" I said. And that's when we just ran and bolted back to the campsite. How did they get up that high in the tree? Why were they on the branches? "Maybe we should leave," I said. "I agree. I don't want to stay here anymore, man," Drew said. We started shoving our food and things back into the trail packs. That's when we heard crunching a few yards away from us in the pitch black darkness of the forest. And Drew aimed his shotgun at the sound, and I slowly raised my rifle. I pulled out the mag light and pointed it to where we heard the sound. We were about 8 yards away from where we heard it. I flicked on the flashlight, and a deer was leaning, its head out beside a tree next to some brush. With some relief, we lowered our guns, and that's when the deer suddenly fell to the floor. The deer's head rolled down the hill and stopped in front of us. Something had ripped or chewed the deer's head off and rolled it down the hill. But that wasn't the reason I was scared. Someone had been holding the deer's head. And then everything clicked. The bones, the guts, and other miscellaneous parts of animals hanging on the dead tree branches. And that's when I looked up, and a grotesque, elongated hand came from around the tree. We bolted down the hill. I didn't care about our stuff. They could be replaced. We faced in and out of running and jogging. We had our lights and we were looking for a landmark. Anything. Something. That's when I remembered that before we came to the trail, there was a big sign with the words, Washita National Forest. I made that a point in my mind and looked around for it with my eyes. My lungs were burning. My legs were in pain, but I kept running. I would glance back and check on Drew and how close he is behind me. I turned off my flashlight, and so did Drew. We laid up against a tree, still as possible. I could see the breath of Drew, frozen in the moonlight. My eyes finally adjusted to the dark, and I looked over at Drew and turned on my light. An arm long and bony, covered in blood, it sank its nails into the shoulder of Drew. Immediately, blood started spewing out. He started screaming in pain, and he was lifted up, screaming louder and more painfully. He was slammed on the ground. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with tears. He was dragged through the forest, screaming, taking shots with his shotgun. With every shot I could see his silhouette, moving further and further into the woods. I ran. I just kept running, and that's when I tripped over something, and I started falling down the rest of the hill. I slammed up against a tree. I stopped and my back was in pain. I realized it was quiet again. There were no crickets. Nothing. Just silence. My eyes already adjusted to the darkness. I could see through the woods. In the distance, the moonlight was shining through the trees. I lay still as possible, and then I heard some shuffling, and I saw that thing moving through the woods. It was strange, jagged, intense. I can't even describe it. It just felt wrong. It was tall and thin. Its bones were rubbing up against its skin. It seemed very malnourished. It shifted back and forth as if it was looking for something. When it turned its face, the grace of the moonlight revealed its features. It was disturbing. It had an elongated chin and small eyes, dark folds of skin around them. The skin was darkish gray. Its mouth was large. It spread all the way across its face. It had its teeth jagged and broken. Its mouth and nose was covered in blood and also in chunks of meat. The blood trailed down and covered its torso. I was about 10 yards away from it, and it crawled on all fours. It started to come towards me. Closer and closer. I could smell it. It smelled like roadkill. That's when I threw up in my mouth and held my breath. My hope at this point was that my death would come quickly. I still had some hope that I would make it out alive. But suddenly, this thing started speaking.
James, James, James.
In the most ungodly voice I ever fucking heard. The part that made my hope disappear was when it started saying my name in my friend's voice.
James, James, James.
It wasn't just like his. It had two tones, one deep, and the other, my friend's voice. It kept saying this and it crawled away through the woods, back up the hill. I stayed there for I don't know how long. I cried silently, and for some reason, I started moving my hand around, and I found something. It was cold and rectangular. I looked closer. It was the lighter that belonged to Drew, and my flashlight had broken on my fall. I stood up slowly and grabbed my bag. I turned and slung it into the woods and ran towards the parking lot. It started screaming my name, but this time, it sounded demonic. This time it was no longer my friend's voice. I kept running and I didn't recognize anything. I flicked the lighter of Drew and scanned the area. My hand ended up hitting something. It was a sign, and with the lighter I read, National Forest. I looked back and heard that same screech, and I ran through the tree line. At a distance I saw my truck. I ran as much as I could, and when I got there I flung the door open and jumped into my truck and started it. I flipped my gears, pulled out, and hit the gas flying out of that parking lot. As I drove, I looked back, and God, I wish I hadn't looked back. It had broken the tree line, and it noticed me driving away. It stopped in the light of the parking lot, now shown in detail. It fucking stood tall. It was at least 9 or 10 feet tall, and its face, I'll never get that picture out of my head. It looked angry, and its eyes were full of hate, and what I assumed at the moment, hungry. I put the pedal to the floor. I tore off the side road and onto the highway. I looked at myself. My jacket was torn and ripped. I was covered in dirt and had cuts and scrapes everywhere. I pulled up to the police station, and according to what information I had gotten, it took a while for the cops to stop me from screaming about that it had killed Drew. A bunch of men got together the next day and rounded up a search party, with the sheriff leading the search. I ended up refusing to go. They scaled through the mountain and searched for my friend. It was nighttime when they found him. He was barely recognizable, they said. They found him under a log. His eyes had been ripped out. His tongue was forcefully pulled out. His arms and legs had been mauled. He had been gutted, and his genitals had been cut off. And his face, they told me his face was scratched and seemed to have been chewed down to the bones. And his neck had been broken in so many places. I can't even express through here how terrible I feel for running and not trying to help him. I still remember his tears streaming down his face before he was dragged away from me. On paper it was reported as a bear attack. After the incident, my grandfather came and talked to me. He said, "I'm so sorry about what happened to your friend. All the people in my town know the existence of that thing. I heard countless stories of local hunters that have came across it." It's been about 8 years. I'm 25 now. There is not a day that passes that I don't think of my friend. He was my best friend. I'll leave you with this warning. If you ever go camping, be careful and keep yourself armed. I never want something like this to happen to anyone. I don't even wish that experience on my worst enemy. However, I still go hunting to this day, but I warn you, never go into the woods in Arkansas. During winter, you may just find something out there that you don't want to find. And it may just be a mental thing, but sometimes at night, when it's really quiet, I can hear my friend calling my name. I have a lot to say, so I'll keep the introduction short. Have you ever heard of Congaree National Park? It's a beautiful REZ, bordered by a large body of water in the south side of South Carolina. To celebrate completing the senior year of our high school, some friends from school and I decided to go on a camping trip. I wasn't the one who organized it, and I ended up showing up late. When I arrived at the park, I had to wait at one end of a trail until my buddy Harry came and got me. After about an hour of trekking through the woods, we arrived at the campsite. It was a lot cooler than I expected. We were sitting right next to a stream, and we had 4 large tents between us. There were exactly 14 people there, more than I expected. There were my 2 close friends, Harry and Tom, and a few I knew from school. There were also 3 people I didn't know. They were cousins or something like that to the others, so I was fine with it. Anyways, that night we're all camping out, roasting hot dogs over the big fire we got going, when some dude comes stumbling through the bushes. Harry gets up and hugs the guy. "Hey, I'm glad you made it." Apparently he was camping with his family who had their RV back on the paved road, and he decided to come up and spend the night with us. We were fine with it because he brought us all some more food and some drinks. He introduced himself as Jeremiah. That's when he starts asking about our friend. He said on his way up he saw some girl off the trail a few feet in the woods, just sort of standing there. Immediately, we knew something was up, because there was only 3 girls with us, and the rest were guys. None of them were gone at any point. So he continued telling his story about the girl. He went up to her and asked if she was part of our group. He then asked if she was sort of slow or something, because she just stared at him, slack-jawed, with a glazed-over look in her eyes. He tried asking her a few more questions, but she never answered. So he just decided, screw it, and continued hiking up the trail. All the while she followed him, only no matter how slow he walked, she was always a little bit behind. He even tried getting her in front of him, but no matter what, she would always fall behind him. Eventually she disappeared, and he figured she just took a different way up to our camp. Anyways, we were like, no, there's no girl with a slack jaw look up here, man. We were all sort of weirded out. He said she must have been from some other camp, and this made us all relax a little bit. The night wore on slowly because it was midsummer, you know, nice and humid. It was around 11 or 12 when we decided to pack it inside the tents. The girls had their own tent, and I was with Tom, Harry, and Jeremiah. The rest of the dudes split off into different groups I can't exactly remember. So we're just chilling, goofing around when this sudden smell hits us. It's real nasty. It smelled like somebody was boiling blood. That's how I would describe it. Or like someone was melting pennies. It was strong as hell. First, Harry gets out, and then me. The smell is even worse outside the tents. It clung to the air like whatever was making it was right nearby. Eventually, everyone else came outside of their tents asking, "What the hell is that?" Covering their noses with their shirts and just complaining about it. One of the girls even started to get a little sick. By now, it's almost pitch black, aside from our flashlights, and we're just like looking around the camp, trying to see if a deer died or something. The next thing we know is that the smell just suddenly disappears. You know how a smell fades away or gets less? It wasn't like that. The smell was just gone. It was there 1 minute, and then missing the next. To this day, I never experienced anything like it. So after a bit of confusion and theory crafting that doesn't go anywhere, we all just get back into our tents. Then one dude starts complaining there wasn't enough space inside, telling the other guys to move over. All of us started laughing. Me, Tom, and Harry were close, and Jeremiah was just an easy guy to vibe with, so we found almost everything funny. In hindsight, we probably should have guessed something was wrong by that comment. So I only got a few hours of sleep because I was real tired when I woke up, like my body just entered deep sleep and got pulled out. Then I realized why I was up. Some dude was screaming like mad in the other tent. We get out as soon as we could, and the guy who's yelling is facing towards the woods, all like, "In the name of Christ we compel you away," and stuff like that. Jeremiah, who's basically you can say the leader of our little group, since he brought all of us some beer, starts talking to the dude. "What the hell, bro? What's wrong?" He turns around, and there are tears streaming down his face. "This guy whispered devil words into my ear. He's cursed. He's cursed." He's an emotional wreck. We sort of look at each other and Harry's like, "What do you mean? Devil words?" He said that he was sleeping and he awoke to one of the other dudes in the tent whispering words into his ear. He said it wasn't normal language, but just a bunch of sounds that didn't fit together. Then he shoved him, and the dude bolted out of the tent, taking off into the woods. At this point, everyone except for one of the girls was out of the tent listening to his story. We were all creeped out. That's when we noticed that the hot blood smell from before was back. This time, it was a lot weaker, but still strong enough to make you think it was nearby. So we're trying to piece this all together as the dude who told our story is calming down. Each of us only knew a few people, and we couldn't really tell who it was that ran into the woods. We got our flashlight set up shooting up into the air so we had a decent amount of light. That's when Harry brings me aside. "Bro," he says, "there's 15 of us." At first I nod, before realization kicked in. Our group had 14 people. Then Jeremiah came, so we had 15. If someone ran into the woods, there should only be 14 of us. Real quiet, we asked the guy if any of the dudes here was the one that said the weird stuff. Right away he's like, "No, definitely not." And so me and Harry kind of freak out. So we decide to tell the group. They're all confused at first. Then Jeremiah stands up. "So you're trying to say when we got into the tents, there was another person with us?" Me and Harry both just sort of nod. That's when one of the girls starts crying. She starts going off about how it was the goat man and we were trespassing into his woods. She starts telling us that she went to school with some First Nation kids who told her about the goat man. He gets into groups of people to mess with them. She starts bawling her eyes out, so the other girls go to comfort her. I'm just hoping she'll shut up about the damn goat man. One of the other guys starts saying that we should just book it out of here, and Harry's like, "No way, not while the sun's still down." Eventually, we agreed to go first thing in the morning, and everyone packed it back into their tents. That night was really weird. Every couple of minutes you would hear this noise from the woods, like a laugh, only it was inverted. It was a really hard to describe sound. Anyways, we made it to the dawn, so we started to get packed up like we promised. Then, of course, one of the kids started being like, "You're not actually serious, right? He thinks we're just playing a joke." Then he starts saying that he wants to stay, and a few other guys are like, "Yeah, me too." So me and my boys were kind of split on what to do. The idea of the goat man, or whatever it was still there in our minds. All of the girls and the dudes that were in the tent with the one that the goat man had spoken to decided to go. So there was only the 4 guys and the guys in my tent. Ultimately, we decided we either go or stay as a group, and since it was Tom's friend, we decided to stay another night. We weren't crazy. We didn't want to run into that thing again, so we moved campsites. We trekked back down to where Jeremiah's family was. Real nice folks. We set up our tents about 20 meters away from the RV. We figured whatever it was wouldn't try to mess with us down here, close to other people. With his family in earshot, we began to relax. Just sort of chilling out, drinking, throwing darts, stuff like that. We didn't intend to let the bad night ruin this trip for us, and we were able to forget about it, for the most part. We noticed the smell was back. Very slight, but it was definitely the same copper and blood smell from before. It hung around all through sunset. One of Jeremiah's parents came over to our camp asking if we were cooking blood, 'cause they could smell it too. Eventually, it came time to go to bed. I'm not kidding. As soon as I finished sipping up our tent, the smell just got like 40 times stronger. It was like being hit with a blood-based stink bomb. It was just so rancid, we all climbed out. That's when we saw the damn thing, weaving between the trees outside of the camp. There was just enough light in the sky to make out its figure. It was probably 7 or 8 feet tall. It was so quick, I could barely get a good look and couldn't make out any features. I might have thought it was a person if it wasn't moving so inhumanly fast. We all freaked the fuck out and booked it back towards Jeremiah's RV. We pounded on the door, scared out of our minds as the thing jittered and crashed through trees outside of the camp. Jeremiah's dad opened the RV, looking real pissed as we were all flooded into it. Lucky for us, it was a pretty big thing, and all 10 of us, the boys, and Jeremiah's parents, were able to fit in. What the hell is wrong with you all? Jeremiah's dad was really mad at us, and Jeremiah started venting. The goat man, he's out there. The what? Jeremiah was about to reply as there was a loud bang at the door we just locked. It sounded like the door was hit with a metal ram, like the kind that cops used to bust into places. What the hell? Jeremiah's dad was the only one speaking. We were all terrified, including his mom. Jeremiah was hugging her as me and my boys just stood there paralyzed. Then, another bang at the door. This time, it was louder, and it was followed by a voice. Let me in. The words were some of the most unnatural stuff I ever heard. It sounded like when you watch those videos of people who taught their pets to speak. Search up a dog talking. It sounded like that. It was so forced. Whatever was out there definitely wasn't human. Seriously. YouTube some of those cats and dogs. That's what it sounded like. Jeremiah's dad knew it was messed up too. As the thing kept banging on the door, he opened up a cabinet above the steering wheel, pulling out a firearm. He primed it before shooting once through the door. What followed was a terrifying scream, like a fucking demon. We heard quick footsteps, sort of like a horse, run away from the campsite and bolt through the undergrowth. Jeremiah's dad then opened up the door, stepping out into the clearing and shooting a few more shots in the air. That night we all stayed in the RV. We were all splayed about, some of us sleeping on the floor. Jeremiah was in the bed with his mom, and his dad was in the driver's seat, which he spun around to face us. He promised us he would keep watch as we slept, but we never really got any sleep. We would hear the thing running around outside, breaking branches. I could have sworn I even heard it whispering,
Let me in
different tones. Finally, the sun came out, and with it, all the noise seemed to fade away as well. Even that horrible smell was gone. Jeremiah's dad wouldn't let us out until the sun was fully up. Then he came with me, his son, Harry, and Tom as we went to go pack up our tents. When we got to the tents though, they were ripped to hell. The support rods were all over the place, and the fabric was shredded on both of them. The goat man, or whatever the fuck it was, really hated campers, I guess. Anyways, after we packed all that was undamaged into the camper, Jeremiah's dad told us he would drive us home. The entire drive though, Harry seemed freaked out, and I didn't know why. Near the end of the park, one of the boys I didn't know too well told us that at this point he would get out, cause he needed to take some ferry or something. I don't really remember what he said. Anyways, strangely, the real quiet kid followed him off. Jeremiah's dad told them both to be safe and drove the rest of us into town. It was only when me and Harry were by ourselves, walking home after taking the bus, when he told me what freaked him out. We live on the same street, so we travel home together. Right as we're pulling up our block, he told me that when we had come back from salvaging the tents, there was another kid with the other group that wasn't there before. The real quiet kid, who got off when we were still in the woods. I couldn't believe I didn't notice it. Harry said he was afraid that if he mentioned it, it was most likely gonna attack, so he just played it calm. So I'm done writing the story, and yeah, I'm still as confused as you are. I'm not sure what that thing was. The goat man, some sort of demon, or something else. I don't think I want to know. Whatever it was, it seemed to have some kind of connection to the woods since it didn't want to leave them, and it took the first opportunity to get off the camper. So I'm gonna hope that it belongs to that park, and it won't leave. I'm never going back to that place again. So if you ever decide to take a trip down to the woods, or to some national park, to go camping or hiking, or spend a few days out there in the woods, take my advice and be careful. If you smell some blood, pack up and go home. There's some stuff in this world that we shouldn't mess around with. Jacob cursed as he pushed through the thick underbrush, trying to make his way to the tree stand he had built earlier in the summer. He was for sure that this location would give him a good sight to the neighboring field, in which he frequently saw large herds of deer. This was going to be his year, and he was sure of it. This is the year that I bring home my trophy buck, he told himself, as he recalled the events of the day so far. He had awakened at 4:30 a.m. He began to get ready for the long day in the woods, on the backside of his farm. His first order of business had been to locate and rescue his gloves and camouflage hunting gear from whatever undisclosed area of his home that his wife had hidden them. He was gonna need them this morning to protect him from the bitter cold November morning. How could it be this cold, this early in the year? He wondered as he started to work on his second task of the day, which was to make a breakfast that would stick to his ribs long into the day. But he finally settled on toast, country ham, and scrambled eggs. He topped it all off with a large cup of coffee that had left a bitter aftertaste in his mouth. In fact, he could still taste it. After this, he packed himself a cheese sandwich for lunch. He grabbed his Remington hunting rifle, some coffee, and headed out the door. He loaded his gear into his truck and pulled out of the driveway and turned right into the one-lane blacktop road that led to the backside of his property. After about 2.25 miles, he turned right again. He had to travel about half a mile down that pitiful rut-filled excuse for a road when he came to his desired location. He then got out of his truck and loaded his gun and walked off into the woods. 10 minutes out of the truck and he was already cold, and it was made worse by the cloudy, overcast day and the wind that was blowing through the trees, making all the leaves rattle like dry bones. Oh well, he thought, it's gonna be a good day anyway, especially if I bring home a big one. Jacob took about 10 more steps when an uneasy feeling began to creep over him. He felt as though someone had stepped over his grave. He got the distinct feeling that he was being watched, but by whom? This was, after all, his property, and it was posted. No one had permission to be on his land. He had to be alone, but if he was alone, why couldn't he shake this eerie feeling that was scratching at the base of his skull? Something was off today. There was a silence in the forest, No birds, no insects, only the sound of the wind in the trees. Convincing himself that it was nothing more than a case of nerves, he continued to press on until he came to a clearing not too far from his tree stand. Stepping into the clearing, Jacob saw the remains of what appeared to be a large deer, but he wasn't quite able to make out what he was seeing from this distance because the sun wasn't completely up yet and the forest was still covered in shadows. Jacob then walked closer to get a better look and found that he had been correct. It was a deer, a large 8-point buck in fact. Looking at the remains, he felt a sense of dread come over him, and icy fingers dance along his spine. Something about this kill just didn't seem right. The throat was completely torn out, and the stomach was ripped open. Plus, also several of the internal organs were missing. This definitely wasn't a coyote kill, and no hunter would have done this. They would have taken the head to have it mounted. What could have done this, he wondered. A fear like nothing he had ever experienced before began to wash over him in waves. What is going on, he thought. At nearly 225 pounds, and well over 6 foot, he wasn't one to give in to fear, but now he couldn't seem to calm down, and his heart was beating like a trip hammer. That feeling that he was being watched was getting stronger by the minute, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was moments away from a bad situation. He slowly started to back away from the mangled body and head back to his truck and back to safety. No more than 6 steps into his journey, his blood turned to ice in his veins as a deep, guttural scream shattered the eerie silence and what was left of his courage. He had grown up on the farm all of his life and had been an experienced hunter since he was a child. He was familiar with every animal in the part of the state. Fear now gave way to stark terror as he chambered around into his Remington rifle and turned around only to find there was nothing behind him. His mind raced with confusion, and he was confronted with a million thoughts at once. What should I do? What could it be? Should I run? Am I gonna die? His survival sense kicking into overdrive. Jacob decided to continue on his previously contrived plan, which was to get to the truck and get out of there. Slowly and cautiously, he made his way toward the perceived salvation of his vehicle, silently praying every step of the way. With 300 yards separating him from his only avenue of escape, Jacob began to hear heavy footfalls off to his left. He could hear the crunching of withered leaves, sticks, and debris that littered the forest floor. Summoning every ounce of courage that remained within him, he forced himself to look in the direction of the noise. And that is when he saw the dark silhouette that followed him through the forest. Quickening his pace, he redoubled his efforts to reach the truck and get to a phone and call the sheriff, the game warden, or anyone that would listen. He couldn't tell what it was that was stalking him, but he could clearly see that it towered more than 7 feet and was incredibly massive. Jacob couldn't help but think that he was about to become a national statistic, a person who left home under normal circumstances and just disappeared without a trace. How many people, he wondered, go into the woods and just vanish, and the authorities just assume that they have become lost, injured, or been the victims of animal attacks, with their bodies never recovered. Please God, don't let that happen to me, he told himself as he drew closer and closer to his truck. 75 yards became 50, and 50 became 30, and 30 became 10. And like a miracle, he was back and opening his door. Throwing his rifle inside, he pulled himself up into the cab and started the engine and hit the gas. but the truck went nowhere. He had parked in a puddle of mud, and now the tires simply spun in place. Not now, he thought. I can't be stuck. Allowing himself a moment to think, Jacob remembered, this truck is a 4-wheel drive. There is no way I can be stuck, and was ready to punch the gas and leave this nightmare behind. Unfortunately for Jacob, some nightmares are not so easily left behind, and there is nothing worse than a nightmare you can't wake up from. And Jacob was about to learn that the hard way. Hearing something to his right, he turned and immediately wished that he had not. It took him maybe half a second to turn his head, but he would have given anything in the world to have that half second back, because it was the last moment that his world would ever see normal again. In that split second, his world changed. It was no longer a place where the world was light and safe, where he was just a husband and a dad and a guy that liked to go hunting and watch football on the weekends. That reality had evaporated away, and all that was left was a world where monsters existed and things really do go bump in the night. And now, an ambassador from that nightmare realm was standing just outside his passenger door, a visible reminder that his world had been turned upside down. Jacob screamed as he stared transfixed on this escapee from a horror movie. In his most terrifying, fevered dream, he couldn't have imagined that such a thing could exist. It was hideously ugly, easily standing 8 feet tall, with a thick, muscular body. There was just something about that face that was just wrong, almost like a mixture of a man and an animal experiment that had gone horribly wrong. It was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. It was completely covered with thick, shaggy black hair that was matted in areas with God only knows what, and it walked on 2 legs, not on 4 legs, like you would expect from some kind of animal. What was this thing that had shattered his perception of reality? Was it a demon? Was it a werewolf? It can't be, he thought. Those things don't exist. But whatever it was staring at him, and it didn't look happy. The menacing juggernaut threw its enormous head back and let out a blood-curdling scream that resonated throughout the surrounding area and seemed to vibrate him to his very core. Shocked back into action, Jacob threw his truck into gear and took off as though he was being chased by the very hounds of hell. Jacob, with his mind racing, wondered what he was gonna do. How will I ever feel safe on this farm again, he thought. Are my wife and children in danger? What and where did this thing come from? And will anyone believe me? The whirlwind of thoughts that swirled through Jacob's mind came to an immediate stop as he slammed on his brakes and nearly slid off the road. In a state of disbelief, Jacob sat staring at the large hackberry tree that laid across the dirt road and blocked his path, preventing him from reaching the blacktop and guarantee safety. How is this even possible, he thought. I just came down this road not even 30 minutes ago, and this path was clear. It was painfully obvious to Jacob that he had to get that tree moved if he was going to make it back home, since he didn't have a chain to pull the tree out of the road, nor did he have a saw with which he could cut up the unexpected barricade. He was left with a few options, one of which was walking, which he discounted immediately. The most logical course of action that he could come up with was to call for help. His best friend Kenny Patterson owned the farm just over from his. If he were home, he could bring a saw and cut the tree up for him. Jacob, with his nerves still frazzled and frayed, reached into his glove box and pulled out his cell phone and dialed Kenny's number. The phone rang 6 times, and Jacob was about to give up when Kenny answered the phone and said, "Hey ugly, what do you want this early in the morning?" As quickly as he could, he told the recent events to Kenny and said, Please, hurry. I'm not kidding. There is something out here. Kenny, hearing the shakiness in his friend's voice, assured him that he would be there in a matter of minutes. Jacob thanked him and hanged up the phone, and braced himself for what he was sure would be the longest few minutes of his life. Sitting motionless inside of his truck, every sound made his imagination run wild with fear. Even though little more than 3 minutes had passed since he had spoken to Kenny, it felt as if hours had passed. The clock seemed to be an eternity. Jacob frequently checked in all directions for any sign to see if this nightmarish monstrosity had pursued them. In every shadow that the forest and on this cloudy day produced, he thought he saw the shape of the black beast that had followed him out of the woods, and he was afraid that he would lose himself long before Kenny arrived to clear the tree out of his path. After what seemed like a lifetime, Jacob heard the sound of Kenny's old truck sputtering up the road, and in just moments, he was able to see the old red Chevy as it made its way closer to him. Jacob's spirits lifted when he saw his old friend, and a sense of relief washed over him as he realized that he was no longer alone. Stepping out of his truck, Jacob said, "Man, what took you so long? I told you to hurry." Kenny, with a surprised look on his face, "What are you talking about? You only called me 11 minutes ago. I think I made pretty good time." Jacob could hardly believe that only 11 minutes had passed. It had seemed so much longer. After apologizing to his friend and telling him exactly how happy he was to see him, both men walked over to the fallen tree and made a discovery that startled them both. The tree had not broken. It had not been cut. It had been pushed over and completely uprooted. All around the tree were large bipedal footprints that had a somewhat human appearance to them. But if they were human, the owner would require a size 28 shoe. Jacob and Kenny looked at each other, and then without a word, went to work on the tree. Kenny took a chainsaw from the bed of his truck and began to cut up the fallen blockade. Meanwhile, Jacob pulled the logs and debris from the road. Mission accomplished. Kenny put away his saw, and he and Jacob were about to get in their vehicles and leave. But before they could even open their doors, an ear-splitting scream erupted from the woods behind them. Jacob walked over to Kenny and whispered, "That's what I was telling you about. I don't know what that thing is, man, but it looks like some kind of monster, and I think we need to get out of here, now." Kenny looked as though the blood had drained completely out of his face, became very pale, as he said to Jacob, "Jacob, man, I never mentioned this to anyone before now, but over the last few months, that thing has been killing off a few of my cows. Their throats are usually torn out, and the bodies are mangled and broken. I didn't want anyone to accuse me of being crazy and making stuff up, so I never said anything about it. But that's the reason I rushed over here when you called. I actually heard that sound a few times off in the distance at night, but never this close. So I think you are right, old buddy. It's time to go." Cautiously and with a sense of urgency, Jacob and Kenny climbed into their vehicles and made their way back into the blacktop. Both vehicles then began the 2.5-mile trek that led back to Jacob's house so they could decide what course of action should be taken. Jacob could feel the temperature drop as snow began to gently fall. He then reached over and turned his wipers on as snow began to pelt the windshield harder. As he passed his neighbor, William Springer's farm, he noticed a herd of deer grazing in the field that bordered his own property. Having put a distance between himself and the nightmare he had just encountered, Jacob felt a renewed sense of security as his fatigued nerves began to calm down. Not willing to let this opportunity pass him by, Jacob turned on his hazard lights and pulled to the shoulder of the road and signaled Kenny to do the same. Kenny knew what Jacob was thinking as he pulled in behind him and turned his ignition off. Getting out of his truck, Kenny said. What are you doing, man? We need to get out of here now. Jacob said. I know, and we will. In just a minute, man. I just can't turn this down. I have to take the shot. That's a 6-point buck standing there. It's not the trophy that I wanted, but at least I won't end up going home empty-handed. And after what happened this morning, I think I deserve a little something good. Alright, just take the shot so we can go. I still don't feel right about this, Kenny said. Jacob steadied his rifle across the hood of his truck. He zeroed in on the buck and was getting ready to fire. That's when he heard Kenny make a gasping noise and whisper, Oh my God, what is it, man? What's wrong with you? Raise your scope 3 inches, he said. Raising the scope, Jacob immediately saw what had been the cause of Kenny's alarm. Standing just outside a tree line in the edge of the field was the creature that they had left behind. Not even 5 minutes. Was this thing following them? Was it after the deer? What was it doing? Jacob watched the creature through his scope for a full 30 seconds before it even moved. And when it did, it ignored him and the deer and started to walk towards William's barn that was just about 500 yards from where the woodland demon had been standing. Jacob called out to Kenny and said, Kenny, call William and tell him that there is something trying to get into his barn. I know he has livestock in there, and if that thing gets in it, it will kill all of them. Attempting to get rid of this monster, werewolf, wendigo, or whatever it was, Jacob fired a shot, but missed. The creature turned towards them and glared at them through red, hate-filled eyes, and then began to run towards them at full steam. Kenny, who was still on the phone with William, screamed at Jacob to get in his truck and go. Jacob did as he was told, and Kenny followed right behind him. Starting their trucks, Jacob and Kenny both raced to Jacob's house as though they were driving on the NASCAR circuit. Arriving at home, Jacob, gun in hand, ran inside to get a phone book so that they could call the game warden and the police and get some kind of animal control out there to get rid of this thing. Jacob had just stepped out of his front porch when they heard gunfire coming from over at William's place. Dropping the phone book and running back inside, Jacob grabbed his 12-gauge shotgun and some shells and handed them to Kenny, who took little time in loading it. Jacob and Kenny, now locked and loaded, walked together to their truck and got ready to mount up a rescue for their neighbor William. Simultaneously, both of them stopped in their tracks as a familiar but uneasy feeling crept over them, and Jacob's 2 German shepherds began to whimper and ran under the front porch to hide. Kenny, whose throat had gone dry as a bone, whispered to Jacob and said, I have a really bad feeling about this. No sooner had the words escaped his lips, they heard a scream erupt from the forest off to their right, and the creature exploded from the trees in front of them. Until now, neither man had been able to fully appreciate the colossal size and scope of the beast, but standing less than 30 feet away from them, they were almost overcome by the sheer magnitude of it. Jacob had seen it up close earlier from his truck while sitting down, and had guessed the height at maybe 8 feet. But now, standing there, looking up, he could tell that this fellow was 8.5 or 9 feet tall, and would tip the scale at 800 to 1,000 pounds. It had inhuman long arms that were easily seen beneath its long shabby black hair, which covered it from head to toe. The chest was larger than a 55-gallon drum, and there was little doubt that it could have pulled the arms off an ape, and now it stood there, staring at them. Jacob and Kenny both opened fire without hesitation. The creature screamed with rage as the bullets tore into its massive body, knocking it to the ground, but not killing or seriously injuring it. Jacob and Kenny watched speechless as it crawled into the tree line, struggled to its feet, and limped away. Jacob ran back to the porch and grabbed the phone book and called the local game warden. Nearly 2 hours later, Gene, the local warden, showed up to take their statements and told them that he had been called out to answer numerous such reports in the area. but he wasn't sure what to make of all these reports. "Guys," he said, "I don't know what to tell you. There is no animal in this area, or any area, for that matter, that fits your description. I'm not saying I don't believe you. I just don't know what it is." Jacob, whose face was reddened with anger, said, "Come here. Here's the blood from where we shot it, and here are the footprints." A look of complete confusion washed over Gene's face, and he asked if they would care to go with him as he tried to track it. Jacob and Kenny agreed, but they said they weren't going without a gun. Gene stated that he planned to take his gun as well. All three men loaded their guns and set out following the tracks and droplets of blood that had fallen on the leaves. They followed the trail for about a mile until arriving at a creek that was located deep in Jacob's woods, where the tracks that they were following were joined by others just like them. Some were smaller, but at least one set was larger. Deciding that the safest course of action would be to return home, they all went back to Jacob's. None of them gave up the idea of staying out in the woods longer, since there was now apparently more than one creature, and the cloudy overcast day made the forest seem even darker than it would normally be this time of day. Back at Jacob's, Gene informed them that there was nothing left that he could do but file it under an unknown animal sighting, which made both Kenny and Jacob anything but happy. Jacob and Kenny spent the next couple of days trying to warn their neighbors to use caution when they were out in the forest. Most of their friends just laughed at them and said they had most likely just seen a bear or something. No one believed them except William, who had also seen it himself the same day they had. He had even taken a shot at it, but missed. Jacob, William, and Kenny knew what they had seen, and they knew it was still out there, and they didn't care who believed them and who didn't. Over the next few weeks, more and more neighbors began to take the story a little more seriously, as family pets began to disappear, and other pets were found mangled. Other farms in the area began to find their cows and other livestock torn open, with their throats ripped out. Just a week after shooting the creature in his yard, Jacob's own German Shepherd was found dead, with its throat torn out, and it was hanging across a limb in a tree in his front yard. It almost seemed like a revenge killing. A few days later, one of William's new animals died the same way. Some people in the area still don't believe. They think the whole story was made up. But Jacob and Kenny know that there is still something out there in the forest. They still occasionally find tracks, or a slaughtered cow or goat. They still hear the blood-curdling screams off into the woods at night. They know that there is still something out there, watching and waiting, biding its time. Something cold and cunning and cruel. Something not human, with a taste for blood and revenge. I try to live my life without too many regrets. I had highs and lows like everyone else in life, sure, but I do what I can to not worry too much about what could have happened if I made a different choice, if I maybe hadn't taken the road less traveled. Everyone makes the best decisions they can with the information they have available to them at the time. Going through all the what ifs is crazy, because the only way you would have made a different choice is if you had some other detail, which of course you didn't. You can never be exactly sure what the sequence of events might have looked like if you gone right instead of left. And yet, there is one choice I made, one road that I took, that I just can't help but wonder how things might have turned out if I had only done something different. My job has me move around pretty often. I'm not going to get into what I do. That has no bearing on the story. But a couple of years ago, I was working in Philadelphia and living on the other side of the Delaware River in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. I'm originally from northwestern Pennsylvania, and this was the closest I had been to home since I moved out of college, so I took the chance to go see my parents whenever I could. I knew I would be moving again before long, and my folks aren't getting any younger, so I try to find a weekend every month or so to make the 7-hour trip to visit them. If I had been thinking about it when I was looking for places to rent, maybe I would have tried to live on the west side of Philadelphia instead of this side in Jersey to avoid the rush hour. But by the time I realized, the lease was signed and there wasn't much I could do. The drive to my hometown was pretty boring. I would take the Ben Franklin Bridge across the river, head up I-476 for an hour or so, then a long slog across basically the entire expanse of Pennsylvania on I-80 before another hour north of I-79. The only thing about the drive was how long it would take me to get through Philly, because once I got on the 476 extension, I could predict my ETA within 5 or 10 minutes. My second summer in Jersey, I had taken 2 weeks off and planned on spending the second week back home. Things changed that first Wednesday though, because a big storm came by and knocked out power in a good part of the area where I was living. Dealing with 90-degree heat with no AC wasn't something I felt like spending the first half of my vacay doing. So after one uncomfortable sweaty night, I let my parents know that I was heading over a few days earlier. I should have left first thing in the morning, but because I had a couple of things to take care of before heading out, by the time I finally got on the road that Thursday, it was past lunchtime and getting on mid-afternoon. For whatever reason, the traffic in Philly was heavy, and by the time I finally got through town, I was a good hour behind schedule. Still, based on my timeline, I figured I'd still be able to make it early enough to grab a dinner and beer with my dad and brother before cashing in for the night. There were 2 things I hadn't taken into consideration. One was the number of other folks that, apparently, had the same idea to get out of town that I did, and that the road construction must have sprung up in the time since my last trip home. The interstate highway system is a heck of a thing. Being able to zip along at 65-70, or in some remote places like West Texas even faster than that, makes cross-country travel take a fraction of the hours it would otherwise. I can't tell you the number of times my folks always talk about the days before the interstate, when going to see friends outside of DC would take almost twice as long as it does now. What's truly remarkable to me though, is that even though the entire system of highways was built start to finish in a mere 35 years, it sure seems like when parts of it go under construction, they stay that way forever. Traffic was heavy, but moving, and I was making decent time until I saw the first orange warning signs, letting me know that 4 lanes were reducing to 3, and then 2, and then 1. There were hundreds of cones stretched down the road as far as the eye could see, and see I could, as the cars in front of me reached a complete and total standstill. It was one of the worst deadlocks I had ever been in. Seriously, I think I moved about a mile in about an hour. After about 3 hours, my stomach started grumbling. With an exit just ahead and no end to the traffic jam in sight, I got off and found a diner to grab some dinner. Even if traffic picked up, I still had a solid 5 hours of driving ahead of me. So at that point, I knew for sure it was going to be pretty late that I was getting in. After finishing eating, I got back on the road. Things looked like they were picking up for a couple of miles. But then, I came up to the back end of a jam and was right back to waiting. We were moving a little bit better, I think averaging about 5 miles an hour at this point. But as the sun started edging towards the horizon, I pulled out my phone and started to see if Google could point me in any kind of workaround. It's a funny thing about human nature. Most of us don't like to sit still. Studies at airports show that people would rather walk further to baggage claim to get their luggage, even if the total time would have been less if they had a slightly longer wait at plane side. Well, the power of the internet appeared to be in my favor. even though I-80 still showed a dark red band for another 50 miles or so, there was a southbound country road coming up a few miles, and a northbound a couple after that. Both of these roads looked like they let me bypass the worst of the traffic. Since I spent the better part of the day sitting on the road, my patience was about worn out, and I opted to take the southbound road, even though the app told me it would take about 30 minutes longer to get to my parents' house. I just wanted to get moving again, and reasoned that at this rate, it might take me more than a 35-minute difference to get to the northbound, and that is a choice that I will remember until the day I die. I made the turnoff and felt my mood improve. The signs changed, limiting my speed between 35 and 40 miles an hour, but even that seemed like flying compared to the logjam I spent the last several hours in. The drive was interesting. The road was starting to get a little twisty, with plenty of changes, as it curved up and around the hills of central Pennsylvania. It took me on a general southwest road, but turned and doubled back on itself enough that for the first 30 minutes or so, I had views of the stalled traffic on I-80. Pretty soon after that though, just about the time that the sun was just dipping down beneath a couple of hills in my rear view mirror, the road took a long curve and carried me down and away out of sight of the interstate. Now, something that a lot of people don't know is how big of a state Pennsylvania is. There are plenty of bigger ones, but Pennsylvania is really big, and it's also remote, isolated. The translation of the name means Penn's Woods. After all, the Blair Witch Project didn't have to embellish that aspect of the state. The fact that you could head into the woods and walk for dozens of miles in any way without seeing anything like another human being was pretty creepy. It's got a decent number of big cities. Pittsburgh and Philly both have enough of a population to support major sports teams, but away from those centers of development, there's a whole lot of nothing, and trees, and dark, and lonely roads. Such was the road I was traveling that night, winding through the twists and turns of the Appalachian foothills. I moved around a lot. I mentioned I traveled through most of the states anyways. I sometimes used to wonder, when I would be driving along a patch of asphalt, surrounded by only untamed wilderness, what it must have been like to build such a road. What was it like before man had intruded with our civilization and our machines? What used to live there? But I don't wonder anymore. Not ever since that night, when I made a left instead of right. The road continued to twist back and forth, up and down. As I went deeper into the foothills, the trees grew thicker, branches from either side of the road reaching over and almost touching, forming a natural canopy 20 feet up that blocked out much of my view of the sky and the stars above. I drove with my high beams on, because the idea of streetlights had never entered the minds of whoever built this road. The painted lines were old and not well cared for. I'd never been a good navigator. My parents used to say it was because, when I was a kid, my nose was always pushed into a book during car rides. But I think it's because I'm just bad at it. So it was that. There was no way possible I could be lost, as there were no other roads that I could have possibly turned onto and gotten off track. I also found myself more frequently checking my phone to ensure I was still on the right path, which is how I almost ran into the other car. My mind was wandering, thinking about the fact that my signal bars had dropped and remained at zero for the last 20 minutes, and what possible implications that would mean if I came across some kind of emergency. I raised my eyes back to the road after Google Maps confirmed for the 20th time that I was still on the right path. That's when my brain took a beat to process that I was approaching a vehicle stopped in the middle of the lane. I slammed my foot on the brake. I stopped in time, but not by much. with maybe 5 feet separating my hood from the other car's rear bumper. My heart was pounding in my chest as adrenaline coursed through my body, but my fear quickly gave way to anger. Seriously, what the hell was this guy doing? Not only was he stopped in the middle of the road, but all his lights were off. If I didn't have my high beams on, there was a good chance I wouldn't have seen him, even if I wasn't checking my phone. I could feel my heart beating in the vein on the side of my neck. I'm not somebody who struggles with road rage, and after a couple of quick seconds, I managed to get a hold of myself, not wanting to outright alarm anyone that might still be in the vehicle. I shifted into reverse and backed up about 20 feet, popping my emergency lights on. That's when I started noticing a few strange things about the stopped vehicle, more than just the fact that the lights were out. Of course, it was stopped in the middle of the road, but that wasn't unreasonable, since there wasn't any shoulder that the driver could have moved onto. The strange thing, though, was that the doors were open, those on the driver's side crossing over slightly onto the other lane. And even more was that I saw that an item was dropped out onto the road by the rear driver's side door, something that appeared to be a child's stuffed animal. I considered my options, and after a few seconds, decided that I would have to go against my better judgment to just keep on my merry way and head outside to get a better idea of what was going on. I said earlier my job doesn't have anything to do with the story, which is mostly true, but before you judge my choices, it bears mentioning that I spent some time in the military. An obligation to help people has been drilled into me over the years, and I've seen enough things while deployed to feel I could handle myself. And so, I got out of my car, but kept it running. I popped the trunk to grab the flashlight I keep there, and left my headlights on so I could see what I was doing. I looked up and down the road, hoping to see signs of other cars approaching, but no luck. I called up to the other car as I cautiously started my approach, circling around to the left, to the middle of the road so I'll be able to get a look inside before I got too close. Anyone there? No answer. My headlights were helping, but there were enough shadows to still hide the car's interior. Shining my flashlight, though, easily determined that no one was inside. I moved closer, stopping down by the rear door to pick up the falling object off the ground. It was a child's toy, just like I thought, a stuffed rabbit, with patches showing signs of frequent love. I frowned. If the folks traveling in the car had hitched the ride with somebody passing by, they would have taken the rabbit, or the kid would have been throwing a fit. I shut the rear door and moved up to the front. I put my hand on the hood and found it was still warm to the touch. That means it couldn't have been here too long. I slid into the driver's seat to try and figure out if there was some kind of mechanical issue that would have forced the car to stop, and was startled to find a set of keys still dangling from the ignition. Pressing the brake, I turned the key and the engine started right up. Headlights and the interior light in the roof springing to life. Fuel, oil, temperature, battery, all the gauges looked good. Not even a check engine light. Strange. Very strange. Then I saw the purse in the passenger seat. I picked it up, a normal brown shoulder bag, and briefly rummaged around before finding a wallet inside. Everything appeared to be intact. About $40 in cash, a couple credit cards, gym membership, Sam's Club card. The driver's license named the owner as Mary Walker, a pretty blonde that had just turned 30 the month before. There were a few pictures showing Mary in stage poses, sitting on a blanket under a tree. A huge, bearded lumberjack of a man hugged her from behind, A small ponytail girl with a goofy over-exaggerated smile on her lap. That's when I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. A shiver running down to the base of my spine. Something was very wrong with this situation. I put everything back in the purse and returned it to the seat. I turned off the car and got out, shutting the driver's door behind me. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed 911, holding it over my head to try to get a connection with no luck. Cursing softly, I jammed the red end call button and moved around to the passenger side of the car. I played my flashlight around and noticed that some of the foliage at the edge of the road was bent and trampled, like someone had walked through it. I didn't have enough woodcraft to be able to judge how long ago they might have passed, but even then, I couldn't imagine any scenario for why they would have gone wandering away. Shining my light into the woods, the beam only extended maybe 30 feet through the trees before being effectively swallowed by the greedy blackness. Looking at all the flat grass, at the stuffed rabbit in my hand, then at the dark trees crowding maliciously, my thoughts came back and forth between what I should do. I made up my mind. I had been trained to help people. It was hardwired into my system. There was a child somewhere in the woods. I raised my foot to take a step onto the path, and that's when a white flicker of movement entered the very edge of my flashlight beam. It was Mary Walker. She was naked and walking stiffly, unnaturally, her arms swaying out of sync with the rest of her body, like a puppet being manipulated by somebody who's not an experienced puppeteer. "Hello?" her voice called out. "Anyone there?" That's when more shapes came into view behind her, shambling along. Here, the bearded man who must have been Mary's husband, then their little girl, owner of the well-loved rabbit, both moving as strange as their wife and mother. And now, I could tell there were more, many more, their forms out of the direct light, but so many they caused the darkness to pitch and swell with their strange, staggering passage. Their voices a chorus. "Hello? Hello?" they called. "Anyone there?" Echoing back the questions I was asking only a few short minutes ago when I approached the abandoned car. I took a stumbling step back, away from the woods and the approaching figures. I ended up tripping onto the walker's car, but at that moment, I shone my light up into the pitch recess of the branches, and in doing so, I could just make out, barely, a sort of darkness figure that was crouched, hidden in the upper limits, a void even darker than the trees. Was it my imagination? Those lines of pure blackness that extended from that concealed mass that seemed to pierce the flesh of Mary Walker and her kin, and the countless other shapes moving in sync with them. That's when I sprinted back to my vehicle, engine still running. "Hello?" I shifted to reverse, keeping enough of my head to avoid running off the road as I completed a 3-point turn. "Anyone there?" I took a glance in my rearview mirror. The pale form of Mary Walker stood still just at the edge of the forest where the trees met the road. One hand was raised, signaling me to return, or perhaps waving goodbye. Her face was a mask of confused sadness. I pressed the gas and drove back the way I came. I didn't look back again. The rest of the trip was a fog. At some point after I made it back to the interstate, I called my parents. I let them know that I wouldn't be getting in until late. I drove on autopilot, the traffic jam having cleared while I was off. I thought about calling 911, but I didn't. What would I tell them, and to what end? There was no one left to be helped. I try not to go through life with too many regrets, wondering about what if, but this one, This choice. What if I had left earlier in the day? What if I hadn't stopped for dinner? Maybe I would have still gone left. Maybe I would have been there in time to help the walkers. Maybe I would have been taken by that black thing that was fishing in the darkness. What if I had gone right? Would I still be ignorant, going through life, unknowing that there are these things out there? I try not to think of it too often, but every now and then, all these thoughts turn to the stuffed rabbit. It wasn't until I reached my parents' house that night that I realized I still had that rabbit clutched in my hand. I used to wonder, before man brought our roads and civilization, what was the wilderness like? What lived there? But I don't think about these things no more. I can't afford to. At least, if I don't want to wake up screaming. There are things out there in the woods, in the darkness, in places that humans still have not ventured out to. So be careful when you're out traveling, going into these country roads, and that no matter how bad the traffic is, always stick to the interstate.